Hi, everybody. So I'm back to talk a little bit about state courts. This is going to be a much shorter session, I promise you. So state courts. State courts vary. Every state has their own system. The vast majority of state courts are structured largely like the federal courts, in the sense that you have a large number of trial courts, sort of entry-level courts, a smaller number, or sometimes just one intermediate court of appeals, and then you have one court of last resort. That's the what we would call the Supreme Court in the federal system. But again, there is an incredible diversity of state court systems. Some state courts, their trial courts, are what we call courts of limited jurisdiction. These are courts that are more like the bankruptcy court in the federal system, or the Court of International Trade in the federal system, where the type of case that these courts hear is limited. So for example, some states still have separate juvenile courts that only hear cases involving minors. Sometimes those juvenile courts only hear criminal cases involving minors. Sometimes they hear a combination of cases involving child protective services and juvenile criminal matters. Some have courts of limited jurisdiction that only hear probate matters. Probate cases are cases where somebody is, for example, challenging a will. Believe it or not, there are some judges, that's all they do is manage wills. Most state courts, though, are what we call courts of general jurisdiction, meaning that these trial courts hear both civil and criminal matters. They hear juvenile matters, they hear probate matters, they kind of hear a little bit of everything. In Texas, the trial court system is so complicated. There is this kind of hodgepodge of county courts, district courts, justice of the peace courts. They're kind of all over the place. And I've spoken with some attorneys in Texas, and they assure me that sometimes the attorneys do not know where they're supposed to be. Sometimes the judges aren't sure what they're supposed to hear. It's incredibly complicated to decide which trial court in Texas is supposed to hear your case. Intermediate appellate courts tend to be a little more consistent from state to state. Typically, the intermediate appellate courts have a bunch of judges on them, but they still hear cases in smaller panels of like 3 judges or 5 judges, depending on the state. And then the court of last resort, the vast majority of states have a Supreme Court that looks much like the US Supreme Court, in the sense that it is a single panel of judges or justices, and they hear all types of issues as a matter of last impression. They are the final arbiters of state law. And so these courts may be different sizes, like they may only have 5 justices, for example, but they otherwise look very similar to the US Supreme Court. Texas and Oklahoma are different. Texas and Oklahoma both have 2 courts of last resort. In Texas, those courts are called the Texas Supreme Court, which is the court of last resort for civil matters, and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the court of last resort for criminal matters. I don't know what they're called in Oklahoma, but they have the same civil criminal split. We're special. One of the big differences that we will be discussing soon between state courts and federal courts, honestly, is the way in which judges are chosen. At the federal level, all Article 3 judges are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. In many states, all or most of the judges are actually elected. In Texas, all of our judges are elected, all of them. So it's a very different process. But once they are in office, once they are judges, their institutions and their jobs look very similar to what we see at the federal level. Again, depending on whether a state has trial courts of limited jurisdiction or general jurisdiction, they may hear some types of cases and not others, or they may hear all types of cases. But broadly speaking, we divide the world into criminal cases and civil cases. Criminal, this is what you're probably most familiar with because you've watched Law and Order, or you've watched The Good Wife. Well, I guess they do civil cases also. You've watched Law and Order. And so you are familiar with the criminal justice process. Most people can identify a crime when they see it, right? Civil cases are, there are a huge variety of civil cases. They include torts, which are things like personal injury cases, auto accidents, medical malpractice, products liability cases. For example, if you take a prescription drug that turns out to destroy your kidneys, right? That's a tort. And then contracts, we talked a little bit about contracts in the last module, but contracts are agreements that can be enforced by the courts. Property disputes, so whether or not I am allowed to paint my house bright pink, does that affect my neighbor, for example? Or if I have been using my next door neighbor's driveway for 25 years, does that mean that I can now continue to use that driveway even if he wants me to stop? Those are property disputes. Wills, again, we talked about that a while ago. Again, there are often controversies over the disposition of property after somebody has died. And then civil law also encompasses the world of family law, which is honestly probably the most difficult thing that state court judges deal with. Family law cases are incredibly emotionally taxing, but dealing with divorces and child custody issues and the disposition of property after the dissolution of a marriage. As with the, as with the federal courts, the workload of state courts is definitely sort of tipped in favor of civil cases. For Texas district courts, which is the most common type of trial court in Texas, in 2005, not quite a third of the cases were criminal, but over 2/3 were civil, right? So again, it's predominantly a civil court docket. State courts are important in part because the vast majority of cases go to state court rather than federal court. If you end up in court at some point in your life, chances are good you're going to be in a state court. If you get divorced, if you adopt a child, if you are in a car accident, if you sue your doctor, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, if you have an employment contract that you breach, these are, or if you hire somebody to do work on your house and they don't, they take your money and they never do the work. These cases almost all go to state court. So the bulk of sort of problems that normal citizens have are resolved by state court rather than a federal court. The other reason state courts are incredibly important is that over time, the federal court system has chosen to defer to states in many cases. There's this concept called new federalism, which is a pretty fancy term. For our purposes, what I primarily want you to know about sort of new federalism movement is that federal courts, if they get a case that raises both state law issues and federal issues, if they can resolve it using just the state law, then that's what they will do. They will resolve it using the state law, and they will just ignore the federal issues. So for example, if I sued my employer, of course, is a state entity. So if I sued my employer for violating my First Amendment rights, I would probably sue for violation of the US Constitution, but I would also sue for violation of the Texas Constitution. If the courts could resolve my claim based entirely on my rights under the Texas Constitution, they would never even get to my US constitutional claim. We refer to this as independent and adequate state grounds. So if we can just use state law and solve this problem, we are not going to wade into the thicket of federal law at all. And since state courts are the final word on state law issues, that gives state courts more power. In addition, state courts provide us with an opportunity to experiment, right? De Tocqueville referred to the states as laboratories of democracy. They provide an opportunity in the United States for us to try out institutional arrangements, new rules, new laws, new policies. The same is true for the court system. We can try new arguments. We can try new procedures in state courts where the stakes are a little bit lower and where the cost is smaller, right? Because we're only doing it in Texas, not the entire United States. And then if something works, we can adopt it at the federal court level. So state courts, a lot of times, for example, if an interest group is trying to bring a kind of novel legal argument, they will try it at the state level first, and they will go to different state courts and kind of build up a track record. And then if it's appropriate for a federal court, then they bring that issue to a federal court and hope that the federal court also resolves it in their favor. So state courts can be incredibly valuable for letting us try new legal arguments and try new legal procedures and find out what works best. Okay, I promised this one was going to be short, and it was. And I will answer any questions you have on Wednesday at our regular meeting.